What would you do if the sun began to die? Not from nature, but by design. At the edge of the solar system, a lattice of black satellites has emerged, weaving beams across the star, dimming its light, tightening its grip. Earth's winters are lengthening, crops are failing, storms are rising, and the models say our planet has only months before collapse. But the network is not meant to kill. It's calling, summoning something vast, something unseen, across the gulfs of space. Do we dismantle it and risk provoking the builders? Or let it finish and face what answers the call? For one crew, the choice is more than survival. It's about whether humanity dares to raise its voice in the dark. Join us as we descend into the shadow of the sun, where silence could mean extinction. Section 1. Shadow Fractions. No sunrise should ever look diminished. Yet by the end of September, the difference could be measured not only in charts, but in skin and breath, because the light that reached Earth had thinned by barely 2%, and still the world seemed colder, shadows sharper, crops slower to rise, wind stronger across seas that should have been calm. Satellites first noted the anomaly at the heliopause, where sensors painted black flecks orbiting in silence. Too evenly spaced, too geometrically perfect to be natural, and then within hours 1,000 more appeared, linking themselves with filaments of radiation thinner than laser lines, yet strong enough to bend solar winds into knots. Within 3 days, the lattice stretched across the circumference of the solar system, framing the sun with a halo of obsidian sparks. Astronomers called them nodes, engineers called them machines, and civilians across the world called them omens, because no one could explain how they had arrived or why. Captain Naomi Verne stood at the helm of the Anaphon, her gaze locked on the sun through layered filters, where the once golden fire now flickered as though seen through gauze. Around her, the command deck carried the hush of ritual. Every officer knew they were leaving not for war or for contact, but for something more fragile, because the models predicted that within months Earth would plunge into permanent winter. Crops would fail, oceans would convulse, billions would suffer before the first snow had fully fallen. And so the Council had summoned Anaphon to act not as a weapon, but as humanity's single probe into the black net that had already begun tightening around their future. Dr. Seth Ibarra hunched over the reactor telemetry, muttering that dismantling even one node without precision could cascade radiation feedback through the whole lattice and destabilize the sun's corona. Aya Solanki adjusted her signal arrays, claiming she could hear the beams humming in rhythmic polarizations, almost like stanzas broken across lines of invisible verse. Oleg Markov, silent as iron, reviewed EVA harnesses with the patience of a man preparing to hold wires that might sing themselves into weapons. Naomi breathed once and spoke the order that cut every hesitation into silence. Set course for the heliopause. We follow the shadow fractions until we find the hand that wrote them. Please do press that like button if you have enjoyed this story so far. That would mean a lot to me. Now back to the story. Section 2. Garden at the Edge. The Anaphon crossed the orbits of the outer planets under drives that sang in ultraviolet silence. Her gravitic sails taut with radiation pressure, as if riding on the faint breath of the sun itself. Days stretched long in the void, punctuated only by the relentless tally of instruments cataloging the black lattice that grew sharper with each million kilometers they traversed. By the time they cleared Neptune's orbit, the nodes could be seen without enhancement, black sparks threaded by beams of exotic light that shimmered at wavelengths no human eye was meant to parse. They resembled coral branches suspended in infinite ocean, an impossible reef growing outward, and for all their symmetry, they carried the quiet menace of an architect who understood patience more deeply than time. Aya Solanki sat sleepless in the signal bay, her headphones humming with layered polarizations, each pulse sliding against the next in near-perfect counterpoint, like the echo of a choir rehearsing for a performance no audience had yet arrived to hear. She whispered across comms to Naomi that the beams were not constant emissions but interlaced harmonics, cycling through patterns that resembled old communication protocols. "It isn't random," she murmured. "It's a message, not to us, but through us." Dr. Ibarra frowned at his console, his fingers steady despite the tremor in his voice. "If it's a beacon, then it's summoning, which means there's something out there capable of answering. The question isn't what built them, Captain, but what they expect will come." Oleg Markov, silent until then, finally broke his reserve, his Russian-accented voice deep as stone. "If we dismantle one, do we risk silencing the choir or enraging it?" His words were the unspoken fear laid bare. That humanity had stumbled into a stage set for actors far beyond its reach, and every move might be seen as defiance. Naomi studied the lattice through the forward viewport, where the black sparks pulsed like lanterns strung across the horizon of the sun. "We are not here to worship or to destroy," she said. "We are here to understand. Survival depends on knowing whether this is scaffold or snare." As the anaphon slipped closer, her instruments revealed something stranger still. Each node was not fixed, but adjusting, infinitesimal shifts of position to maintain geometric perfection against solar flux. It was not a dead lattice, but a living geometry, breathing against the currents of the void, and for the first time the crew felt less like explorers and more like trespassers in a garden carefully tended by unseen hands. If you have enjoyed this story so far, then please do subscribe and hit the bell icon to listen to more stories like this one. Let's get back to the story now. Section 3. Voices in Static. They first heard the sun change before they saw it, a hollowing in the radio hiss that every vessel in the system carried in its background feeds, a constant roar of charged particles and magnetic breath that had been the soundtrack of astronomy for centuries. Aya lifted her head from the spectrometer when the familiar storm of noise thinned into filaments, each one phasing in and out with unnatural patience, as though bright sound had been sliced into braided strands by an unseen hand. She stared at the waterfall plot, her breath caught, because the sun's static was no longer chaotic, but woven into measures too precise for chance. She recorded, counted, replayed, and realized the filaments aligned exactly with the dark nodes flickering at the system's rim. The lattice was modulating sunlight itself into a carrier the size of a stellar wind. "This isn't random," Aya whispered, her hands trembling. "It isn't language as we know it, but it behaves like language. There are markers, repetitions, silences, and rhythm. It's structure. It's intent." Dr. Ibarra pressed knuckles to his lips, eyes locked on the screen where bursts matched every pivot of the black satellites as they stitched new beams across their growing cage. "Carrier atop carrier," he muttered, "and the rhythm matches Earth's insolation curve. They're calibrating against us. They're using our planet as their metronome." On Vigilance command, deck silence thickened. Naomi steadied her breathing, fighting the sense that the ship itself had become a microphone placed inside a cathedral whose choir had not yet chosen whether to bless or shatter its listener. "What happens if we speak back?" she asked, knowing the question carried the weight of centuries. "Reply is admission of position," Markov said, voice edged with scars of old wars. "But silence can also be a message, sometimes the worst one imaginable." The dimming ticked another fraction, a cut so slight it seemed trivial, yet every model screamed of collapse. Agriculture ministries issued ration targets. Power grids strained under cold dawns, and talk of a coming winter began to bleed into headlines. On Earth, people argued in streets. Pundits raged on channels. Yet in orbit, the Vigilance crew stared at graphs that only steepened into cliffs. Aya prepared a reply anyway. Not words, not music, but data. She built a narrow-band ghost thread encoded with neutrino flux, soil moisture, fragile climate arithmetic, proof that the world below was alive, vulnerable, finite. She asked with her eyes. Naomi gave the smallest nod. The signal slipped outward, disguised as science, but carrying plea. For 13 minutes, nothing changed. Then the nearest node pivoted and the hiss shifted. A pause appeared, repeating at golden ratio intervals beloved by living systems. Aya's voice cracked as she whispered, "It heard us. It's waiting for us to prove we can tend fire without burning ourselves." Section 4. The Fractured Horizon. The silence that followed Aya's discovery did not bring relief, but fracture. Because once it was clear the lattice could hear, every government and faction on Earth scrambled to seize the right to speak, and the thin threads of unity that had held through energy rationing snapped like brittle glass beneath strain. In the Council's orbital amphitheater, ministers and admirals rose in overlapping waves of fury, some insisting that any reply must be cautious and collective, others shouting that silence alone offered safety, and a third block warning that every second without response brought the beacon closer to completion. Dr. Ibarra leaned across the table, voice almost lost beneath the uproar, reminding them that while politics debated endlessly, the sun dimmed in increments that obeyed physics alone, and no rhetoric could add calories back into Earth's air. Naomi watched faces dissolve into accusation and fear, her jaw tight as she understood that hesitation had become indistinguishable from surrender. The fracture spread further when intelligence briefings revealed the lattice's geometry, showing that its beams converged at certain nodes like hinges in a vast machine. One such node, located near the heliopause corridor, braided 3 streams of exotic radiation into a single rhythm that governed dozens of downstream satellites. If shifted even slightly out of phase, the pattern would lose synchronization, forcing a rescan that could delay the signal's completion for weeks. Markov highlighted the hinge with a stylus and muttered that there was the seam, the one place where humanity could buy time without immediately firing the first shot. The room fell quiet for the first time that day, not with agreement, but with the grim knowledge that the window for action was closing. Crops were already failing along the equatorial belts, heating grids were overdrawn, and ration lines had stretched from inconvenience into unrest. Time itself had become the enemy. Plans scattered across the table like knives. One proposal called for stealth insertion. A team dispatched aboard strike craft to plant resonance charges along the hinge's lattice. Another demanded overt destruction. Mirror sail torches aligned to melt the node's skin until its synchronization shattered. A third came from Ibarra herself, voice trembling with the weight of risk, not sabotage, but demonstration. She argued that the pause Aya had identified carried golden ratio intervals, a signal unlikely to be waste, suggesting the lattice might be listening for a proof of worth. If humanity could align rival fleets into one synchronized maneuver, multiple vectors burning in coordinated thrust, the network might register coherence and throttle its own beacon. It would mean convincing enemies to share propellant, navigation keys, and trust forged in the same breath as fear. The Council could not decide, but Naomi did. Back aboard Vigilant, she ordered preparations for the impossible. A joint flotilla of ships that had nearly exchanged fire in past disputes now asked to burn as one. Volunteers crossed from Mars, Luna, and Earth, their faces grim but resolved. In the hangar, Naomi's voice carried across the intercom, steady despite the weight in her chest. If the lattice measures who we are, let it measure all of us together. If it is a trap, then we will spring it together too. Engines hummed into a single rhythm, fragile but defiant. And as the flotilla fell sunward, Aya swore the static in her headset shifted once more, as though something vast and unseen was listening for the next note. Section 5. The First Push. The flotilla burned toward the hinge in silence. Not the silence of discipline, but the silence of disbelief. Because every pilot and engineer aboard knew that a week earlier the idea of Martian ships sharing telemetry with Terran fleets would have been mocked as fantasy, yet now their lives depended on it. Naomi stood at the center of Vigilance Command Theater, her hand resting on the railing while screens painted trajectories like threads across a loom, each one delicate enough to snap if thrusts were misaligned by even fractions of a second. The hinge node glimmered faintly at the edge of their scopes, 3 ribbons of exotic radiation twisting into a braid that pulsed in rhythm with the rest of the lattice, a heartbeat too precise to be mistaken for chance. Aya's voice carried across the intercom, low but steady, reminding them that this would not be battle in the traditional sense. They were not firing to kill, not even to break, but to test whether unity could be read as signal instead of sabotage. Markov barked timing commands, his accent sharp as flint, while Dr. Ibarra translated the lattice's golden intervals into thrust windows so narrow that even mechanical delay threatened failure. Engines hummed with restrained violence, their fusion bells trimmed to whispers of acceleration. And for a moment, the flotilla seemed less like a fleet than an orchestra tuning its strings, every note fragile, every misstep capable of collapsing harmony into chaos. Naomi's knuckles whitened against the rail as she gave the command. On my mark, burn. Flame erupted in silence, blue-white crescents fanning outward, each ship cutting precisely along its assigned trajectory. Telemetry streamed across the flotilla in perfect synchronization, Earth and Mars, Luna and Titan all burning as one. The hinge node shivered. For an instant the lattice dimmed, its braid of radiation unspooling like threads slipping through a loosened knot. Cheers erupted across comms, raw and unrestrained, voices cracking as months of fear seemed to lift. But before relief could crystallize, Aya gasped that the pause was too shallow, that the lattice had not shut down but recalibrated, its rhythm adjusting to accommodate the disturbance. On sensors the braid reformed, brighter than before, its pulse quickening as though awakened by the challenge. "We didn't delay it," she whispered. "We provoked it." Naomi clenched her jaw as alarms flared across Vigilance Bridge, panels lighting red as the node projected streams of interference toward the flotilla, not weapons in the conventional sense, but beams of distortion that bent inertial paths into spirals. One Martian frigate spun helplessly off course, its stabilizers screaming under impossible stresses, while an Earth destroyer's shields dissolved into static before reconstituting seconds too late to matter. The flotilla held formation only through sheer defiance, thrusters firing in desperate microbursts to counter bends in space itself. On the scopes, new nodes brightened across the lattice, dozens of black satellites shifting into fresh alignment, their beams converging like eyes turning toward prey. Markov swore in fury, declaring that the test had failed, but Ibarra shook her head, voice trembling yet resolute. "No, it reacted. That means it understood." Naomi forced her voice steady, even as sweat stung her eyes. "Then we will speak again, louder." Across the fleet, captains tightened their grips on controls, knowing that humanity had been heard, and that being heard might prove as dangerous as being ignored. Section 6. Ashes of the Hinge. The aftermath was not silence, but static, a storm of interference that scraped across every channel until comms officers winced as though the noise itself were claws against their skulls. Vigilance hull shuddered with phantom impulses, ripples of distortion sweeping through her plating as if the lattice had decided to shake loose any ship that dared remain within reach of its hinge. Naomi gripped the railing until her knuckles ached, eyes fixed on the burning wreckage of the Martian frigate that had been flung into uncontrolled spin. Its final transmissions were a blur of curses and prayers, cut short when the vessel's frame folded against its own inertia, a bloom of debris scattering across the void like embers from a drowned fire. Markov's face on the tactical feed was carved from stone, rage held in check by discipline, though his voice carried a promise. The sacrifice would not be wasted. Dr. Ibarra leaned over her console, translating the storm of interference into graphs that trembled with impossible symmetry. "It's not random," she said, her tone both horrified and awed. "The static is structured, layered harmonics stacked like chords. It's speaking back." Aya's face paled as she confirmed the finding, pointing out that the interference matched ancient phonemes buried within human languages, syllables reshaped into vibration. "It learned from us," she murmured, "or it remembered us from before we began." The idea spread across the bridge like contagion. Every officer, suddenly aware that their strike had not been ignored but absorbed, their voices amplified into a conversation they could neither refuse nor control. Naomi forced clarity through the rising unease. "Catalog every sequence. Find meaning if you can, but remember, understanding is not agreement." She turned to Markov, her words iron. "Prepare contingency strikes. If this network is listening, it may also be waiting for the right moment to answer with more than noise." He nodded grimly, dispatching orders across the flotilla. Though several captains hesitated, their hesitation painted across open channels in the form of whispered doubts. What if dismantling the lattice was the very act that summoned what lay beyond? The doubts grew heavier as fresh readings arrived from Earth. Climate monitors now registered a solar deficit more severe than predicted, the lattice dimming intake by a fraction that translated into billions of lost watts across the globe. Crops withered under skies that felt colder despite clear daylight, while storm systems twisted into unseasonal fury. Broadcasts carried images of flooded cities and darkened farmlands, fear hardening into anger as citizens demanded to know why their fleets were provoking the unknown rather than destroying it outright. On Vigilance Bridge, Mara Elin of the Dauntless appeared via secure channel, her voice sharp with accusation, declaring that every second spent probing the lattice brought Earth closer to collapse. Naomi bit down her response, swallowing the urge to snap, and instead said quietly, "Every second spent blindly striking may bring something worse." The lattice shimmered again, its black satellites shifting as one, beams converging into a geometry so precise that even Aya faltered in awe. "It's aligning to new harmonics," she said, "but not toward us, toward the dark beyond." Naomi felt the truth like a blade against her chest. The black SUNNET was not defending itself. It was calling louder. Section 7. Echoes of the Builders. The fleet gathered data in silence, as though any careless word might deepen the resonance already threading through their hulls. Vigilant scanners painted the lattice in harsh relief. Each satellite was not a simple construct of alloy and circuits, but a monolithic fragment, surfaces etched with grooves that flickered faintly under wavelengths no human eye could follow. Dr. Ibarra's analysis confirmed what no one wanted to believe. The grooves were inscriptions, not functional markings, but records, sequences layered into matter itself, repeating across every satellite like scripture chiseled into a cathedral of orbit. When translated through harmonic models, the inscriptions suggested lineage, a progression of empires that had each bent themselves toward the same design, a lattice woven around suns not as weapons but as declarations. Aya whispered the phrase that chilled every officer on the bridge. "It's a beacon of civilizations. Each layer tells who built it before." Her models unfurled across the tactical display, showing stars dimmed by similar constructs, systems marked with evidence of collapse. Some were hundreds of light years distant, others so far their echoes had aged beyond relevance. Yet the pattern was clear. Whenever the lattice was completed, something answered, and the system was never the same again. Markov's jaw tightened as he spoke. "We are not the first to face this. The builders left warnings carved in stone, and still they failed. Why would we succeed where they could not? His challenge cut through the air like a blade, leaving Naomi to steady the bridge with a voice both calm and unyielding. Because we are not built to surrender. We study, we argue, we fight, but we endure. If this is a test repeated across eons, then we will answer differently. The declaration steadied the crew, yet tension lingered like static beneath the skin. Messages from Earth grew sharper, councils dividing into factions that mirrored the inscriptions themselves. Some saw the lattice as a heritage to be claimed, proof that humanity was invited to join a lineage older than recorded time. Others demanded immediate annihilation, arguing that survival could never coexist with forces that enslave suns. Naomi read every communique, her heart heavy, knowing that indecision was already fracturing their unity as surely as the lattice dimmed the skies. Then the satellites shifted once more, their beams no longer linking sun to void, but bending inward, converging into the heart of the lattice itself. Sensors screamed as gravitic harmonics spiked, revealing a hollow chamber at the center of the construct, a region shielded by exotic fields that bent light into shadow. Aya gasped as she realized what it was. A memory core, a vault where the builders had preserved their last attempt to speak. Naomi ordered a strike team prepared, because answers would not be found at a distance. Humanity had to step inside the echo of civilizations lost to learn why they had summoned the dark, and why they had fallen silent after. Section 8. Into the memory core. The strike craft departed vigilant with engines muted to a whisper, as though silence itself might shield them from whatever intelligence still lingered inside the lattice. Naomi watched from the command deck, her hands clenched behind her back, knowing that once her team crossed the boundary into the hollow chamber, they would not simply be explorers, but witnesses of decisions older than Earth's first fires. Aya led the detachment, her voice steady over comms, though her pulse betrayed anticipation edged with dread. Beside her, Commander Hale braced in silence, his focus narrowing not on discovery, but on contingencies, because the lattice had already proven it could bend light, time, and will. As the strike craft threaded through converging beams, the walls of the chamber seemed less like machines and more like the ribs of some titanic organism, black metal veined with currents that pulsed in intervals too precise to be random. Gravity rippled as if refusing stability, forcing the pilots to compensate constantly, their instruments reporting weight one heartbeat and near zero the next. When the field finally stabilized, the void ahead blossomed into clarity. An obsidian sphere floated at the center, surfaces polished so smooth it reflected stars that were not there, constellations twisted into impossible alignments. Aya's voice dropped to a whisper. It is a library. Scans confirmed her intuition. The sphere was no weapon but a vessel of information, encoded not in language or symbol, but in harmonics carried through gravity itself. Every vibration of the core was a syllable, every oscillation a phrase. Yet the scale of data was overwhelming, orders of magnitude beyond anything human minds could parse unaided. Dr. Ibarra's algorithms struggled to capture fragments, yielding visions stitched from resonance. Cities burning beneath collapsing skies, fleets swallowed by waves of radiation, and a single motif repeating through every collapse. The lattice completed, a signal answered, and silence thereafter. Hale demanded immediate extraction, arguing that the core was not warning them, but binding them, drawing humanity into the same script already carved across countless systems. Aya resisted, insisting that fragments of variance existed, anomalies where collapse had been delayed, worlds that had endured a little longer by choices recorded within the harmonics. If there is even a sliver of a path different from extinction, she pleaded, we have to see it through. Naomi listened in silence. Her decision weighted heavier than any command she had carried before. Extraction meant safety, but also ignorance. Staying meant risk, but perhaps also salvation. She ordered the team deeper, to sync their own gravitic signatures with the pulse of the core. The chamber brightened in response, harmonics rising until even Vigilant's hull trembled from orbit, and suddenly the sphere unfolded. Not in fragments of data, but in direct translation, a voice resonating not in ears, but in marrow, announcing itself as the testament of civilizations that had tried and failed to speak with the dark between stars. Section 9. The Beacon's Truth. The voice that rose from the sphere was not a single tone, but a symphony of resonance, layered in harmonics that bent thought itself into comprehension. And though the words were never spoken aloud, every listener aboard Vigilant felt them as if they had been whispered directly against bone. It did not introduce itself as a god or a conqueror, nor did it claim dominion over the stars, but instead it called itself a relay, a surviving node of something larger, a monument left by builders who had not endured the call they once summoned. Aya staggered against the console as fragments of memory cascaded through her, not visions of light or image, but of gravity folding like cloth, stars dimming under waves of arrival, and civilizations extinguished not by invasion, but by the consequence of being noticed. Naomi pressed her palms flat against the holodable, demanding clarity through the confusion, and Dr. Ibarra's voice wavered as she confirmed what the algorithms had extracted. The lattice was not a weapon at all, but a beacon, a construct designed to amplify a signal across interstellar voids until something vast and unseen could answer. The testimonies encoded into the memory sphere all repeated the same arc, species encountering the lattice, hesitating as humanity now hesitated, dismantling fragments only to trigger retribution, or allowing it to complete only to invite a silence that consumed their skies. The end was always the same, and yet buried within the repetitions lay hints of variance, moments where survival extended longer than fate seemed to permit. Hale clenched his fists, his voice raw with fury, declaring that the beacon was nothing but a snare, a cruel experiment repeated across eons, and to interact with it further was to doom Earth to the same annihilation written into every record. Aya countered with equal fire, insisting that those fleeting anomalies were not accidents, but possibilities, that perhaps humanity's difference lay not in silence or surrender, but in shaping the lattice before it finished, rewriting the message rather than destroying the transmitter. On Earth, the consequences of delay were already unfolding. Satellites reported further dimming of solar intake, weather maps filling with spirals of unseasonable storms while energy grids across Europe collapsed under frozen demand. News feeds poured chaos into every household, governments torn between calls for immediate destruction and voices urging patience to decode the message fully. Naomi knew that paralysis had become its own weapon, wielded not by enemies, but by the weight of indecision itself. She stood before the command theater, her crew watching, her heart caught between Hale's demand for fire and Aya's plea for translation. With measured breath, she gave the order that would fracture consensus across the system. The lattice would not be destroyed, not yet, but neither would it be allowed to complete unchecked. They would attempt what no prior civilization had dared, to alter the beacon mid-song, to inscribe humanity's own voice into the call before it reached whatever waited in the dark. The sphere pulsed an answer, harmonics rising as though it understood, and for the first time since its awakening, the black SUNNET seemed to listen. Section 10. The Choice of Fire. The Council's emergency session burned across secure channels, each block projecting its emblem beside leaders who spoke not with patience, but with the brittle urgency of those who saw their hours dwindling. The Pan-Eurasian Directorate demanded the beacon be shattered entirely, citing simulations that showed agricultural collapse within 6 months if the dimming continued, their delegates leaning forward with voices tight, as if each word carried the weight of starving nations. The Martian assembly countered that destruction risked triggering a failsafe built into the lattice, a reflexive defense that could bend space-time across orbits and tear colonies apart before Earth even tasted the relief of sunlight restored. The North Atlantic Alliance, usually divided, spoke with rare unity. Humanity had reached the point where waiting was indistinguishable from surrender, and action was demanded whether the target was dismantling or rewriting. On Vigilant, Naomi's hands trembled as she accepted the secure feed, her crew watching with faces that revealed not doubt but exhaustion, because they had all witnessed the storms that raged below and the fracture lines spreading through their own command structures. Io whispered that the lattice pulsed faster now, as though the act of human debate alone had altered its rhythm, and Dr. Ibarra added that the harmonics carried adaptive patterns no algorithm could stabilize, meaning delay itself was feeding the intelligence encoded into the structure. Hale stood rigid at the periphery, his jaw set with the ferocity of a soldier who had already chosen destruction and now endured only the agony of politics. The vote unfolded with all the drama of centuries compressed into a single hour. Delegates shouted across one another, accusations of betrayal searing through the channels, until Admiral Kalen slammed his fist against the council table and silenced them with a glare heavy as gravity itself. His words were carved from iron. Hesitation had become a weapon wielded against them, and survival demanded unity, even if that unity was born from fear. When the count concluded, the directive was delivered not with triumph, but with the exhaustion of compromise. Humanity would attempt both paths. Strike teams would be dispatched to destabilize peripheral nodes of the lattice, while Vigilant and her crew would try to inscribe a human voice into the beacon's core. Destruction and dialogue would march together. Neither trusted, but both carried as the last gambles of species unwilling to surrender entirely. Naomi closed the feed with hands that ached from gripping the console, her reflection faint against the darkened holodeble. She whispered to herself that humanity had not chosen a path, but had chosen contradiction, and perhaps contradiction was its truest nature. The crew around her absorbed the order with grim silence, and Aya leaned close, murmuring that the beacon's harmonics had already shifted again, as though it had heard and understood not unity, but fracture. Hale's only reply was a single sentence, spoken like a vow. Then we must teach it what fracture means. Section 11. The Sun's Eclipse. The strike began not with a roar of triumph, but with the quiet precision of desperation, because humanity had no strength to waste and no certainty that their weapons would even matter against the lattice that spanned the solar system's edge. The first task groups departed from Titan's shipyards, their hulls blackened to mask their signatures, while Mars launched a spear of cruisers stripped of escort to maximize acceleration, each commander aware that survival was less important than impact. From Earth's high orbit, swarms of autonomous drones ignited their engines in coordinated silence, forming lances of metal and plasma that angled toward the dark horizon where the beacon nodes burned against the background of stars. On Vigilant, Naomi and her crew watched telemetry feed ripple across the war table, glowing arcs tracking the simultaneous advances, and she whispered that no fleet had ever carried such a contradiction within its orders, because their weapons sought to burn while their voices sought to speak. Aya's voice cut through the dim with quiet awe as she reported that the lattice did not respond as a fortress, but as an orchestra, shifting harmonics in precise counterpoint to every acceleration vector, bending space in gradients so subtle that warheads drifted milliseconds behind their intended trajectory, enough to slide past the nodes as though missing by design. Hale snarled that it was reading intent, not thrust, anticipating fire before the trigger even engaged. At the same moment, Naomi's order pressed Vigilant into the lattice's inner span, its hull encased in adaptive fields tuned by Dr. Ibarra's trembling algorithms. The ship shook as though dragged across tides unseen, gravity rewriting itself in pulses that struck marrow harder than metal. Yet inside the bridge, the crew held formation. The beacon's core loomed ahead, a black geometry that swallowed light and returned only reflections of what instruments already feared. Naomi gave the order to begin transmission, her voice calm even as storm winds rattled across Earth's oceans far below, the planet itself groaning under tides that mirrored the beacon's pulse. Aya triggered the harmonics, weaving human language into the lattice's rhythm, a sequence of tones that carried not threat but identity, broadcasting the simple truth of who they were, a truth etched in every syllable of humanity's shared voice. For a heartbeat, silence reigned, as though the sun itself had been smothered. Then the beacon dimmed, a shroud spreading across its structure, and every sensor across the solar system screamed the same word in data streams unreadable to the untrained eye, but undeniable to those who understood. Eclipse. The beacon was no longer summoning. It was answering. Section 12, the last transmission. The silence that followed the eclipse was heavier than battle, a weight that pressed on marrow as though the lattice itself had drawn breath and now waited to exhale. Every ship in the coalition held position, engines cold, weapons inert, as officers stared at instruments no longer showing acceleration vectors or targeting locks, but only a single, impossible truth. The sun had dimmed by a fraction more, the network tightening into a geometry that made stars bend along unseen curves. Naomi stood at Vigilant's command table, her throat dry, knowing that in this moment their choice mattered more than any weapon, because to strike blindly now was to provoke a force they could not name, while to hesitate meant watching Earth's oceans freeze. Aya's voice shook as she translated the pulse hidden in the harmonics, her eyes wide with the strain of holding focus against signals designed to overwhelm cognition. The beacon was not asking questions. It was presenting coordinates. A string of locations carved into the black beyond the Oort cloud. Distances so vast, no human probe had ever mapped them, each sequence marked by resonances that spoke not of attack, but of destination. Hale cursed that they were being summoned, conscripted as if children called to an elder's table. Yet Dr. Ibarra countered that the pattern suggested more than dominance. It suggested expectation, as though humanity's resistance had earned recognition. The council channels flared in chaos, leaders shouting that dismantling the network must remain priority, that no coordinates could be trusted when Earth's climate was already collapsing into storms of ice and fire. But Naomi silenced her own crew's protests with a single order: continue the transmission. She understood that communication itself had become the battlefield, and that the only victory lay in proving that humanity would not collapse in a silence or fracture. Vigilance harmonics pulsed again, this time embedding a message of refusal. Not submission, not obedience, but coexistence. The truth that Earth would not yield its voice even if the sun itself dimmed to shadow. For a long, suspended heartbeat, nothing replied, and Naomi feared that they had signed Earth's death warrant with syllables too fragile to matter. Then the lattice shifted, beams of exotic light retracting like threads pulled from a loom. And for the first time since its arrival, the sun brightened, just enough for every frozen city and storm-racked shore to feel the warmth. The beacon did not collapse, nor did it vanish. It folded outward, fading into geometry invisible to human eyes, leaving behind only the memory of its shape burned into satellites and the fear of what paths it had opened. On Vigilance Bridge, Naomi exhaled a breath she had carried for months, whispering that survival was not victory, but it was enough. Aya leaned back, trembling, and said the words that carried across the commnet to every ship and every home. They know we are here, and they know we are not silent. Earth would rebuild beneath a sun that still shone, but the shadow of the black SUNNET lingered, a reminder that some transmissions cannot be unmade, and some answers wait across distances humanity was now destined to cross. Please do press that like button if you have enjoyed this story. And also please do subscribe and hit the bell icon to listen to more stories like this one. That would mean a real lot to me. Now go ahead and listen to your next story here.